He was just mopping the courtroom floor when a white officer slapped him in front of everyone. No one knew this quiet black janitor was the father of the judge presiding over the case. He didn't shout, he didn't fight back. But what came next shook the entire justice system. Why would a man hide his true identity, even from the people judging him? If that question made you stop and think, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Now let me tell you the story behind the silence. They say you can tell a lot about a man by the way he walks into a room. But Luther Miles didn't walk into rooms. He drifted through them, quiet, unnoticed, like he was trying not to disturb the air around him. At 62, with salt and pepper hair and worn work boots that never made a sound on the courthouse tiles, he was the kind of man people looked past without a second thought. Not because he was invisible, but because they chose not to see him. Most folks at the Crestwood County Courthouse called him Old Luther, if they called him anything at all. He was the janitor, the guy with the mop bucket and the slow, steady rhythm. He was always there early, left late, and never missed a day. You'd pass him in the hall, see him in the break room microwaving day-old leftovers. Maybe nod if you were feeling polite, but you'd never stop to wonder who he was or what kind of life he'd lived before pushing that mop. I was new to the courthouse then, fresh out of school, still trying to figure out where the copy paper was kept and how to read a judge's mood before a hearing. My name's Jaden. I worked in admin, and I'd be lying if I said I noticed Luther right away. He didn't talk much. He moved quiet. But there was something about him, something I didn't understand at first. Every lunch break, while most of us scrolled our phones or griped about caseloads, Luther would sit by the window near the service closet, flipping through a thick, battered book. It wasn't a Bible or a sports magazine. It was a copy of Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England, hardcover, faded spine pages, worn from years of use. I remember watching him trace a line of text with one finger, lips barely moving, as if he were rehearsing something only he needed to know. I asked him once, half joking, why a janitor was reading something that dense. He looked up, eyes sharp, but kind, and said, "Understanding the law doesn't cost more than the ink it's printed with. Just the patience to listen." Then he smiled and went back to reading, like that was all the answer I'd earned. The thing about Luther was he didn't move like a man broken by life. He moved like someone who'd already fought his biggest battle and chosen to step back. Like someone who could walk into any room, read it in seconds, and walk out without leaving a trace. That's what made him so strange in a place like this. At Crestwood, everyone was trying to climb higher case wins, faster promotions, louder reputations. But Luther moved in the opposite direction. He didn't compete. He didn't complain. He just worked, cleaned, watched. Always watching. Kyle Branson, the courthouse security officer, didn't like that. Kyle was the type who liked knowing who had power and who didn't. Young, brash, proud of his badge, and even prouder of his ability to make others uncomfortable. To him, Luther wasn't a person, just a fixture. The kind of man you snapped your fingers at when you spilled coffee. I saw it one morning. Kyle brushed past Luther near the courtroom entrance and muttered just loud enough, "Still crawling around here with that mop. You ever consider retiring, old man?" Luther didn't flinch. He didn't respond the way I probably would have. He just straightened up, met Kyle's stare for a second too long, then said with a soft voice, "I mop up what others leave behind." Kyle scoffed and walked off, but that line stuck with me. Not because it was clever, but because Luther meant it. And somehow I had a feeling he wasn't just talking about dust and footprints. Most days Luther wore the same thing, a gray work shirt tucked into black pants, belt-tight collar neat. His ID tag always straight, always visible. It was like he followed rules no one else could see. And maybe that's why I started paying attention, because under the quiet routine, the silence, the soft voice there was something held back, something heavy and deliberate. He didn't belong to the noise of the courthouse, and yet he was part of its bones. Not a janitor, not just, more like a presence. One that made the space feel grounded even if no one said it out loud. Some people thought he was strange. Others thought he was dull. But I started to think Luther Miles knew more about this courthouse, about its people, its shadows, and its truths than any of us ever would. And it turned out I wasn't wrong. I just didn't know how right I was until the day everything changed. There's a certain type of man who walks into a room and demands respect. Then there's Kyle Branson, who demands fear instead. He was the kind of officer who treated his uniform like armor and his badge like a weapon. At 35, Kyle wasn't old-school law enforcement. He was new blood with an old mindset. Sharp haircut, tight jaw eyes that scanned everyone like he was searching for a threat. Though the only people he ever barked at were the ones he thought couldn't bite back. And the person he went after most, Luther Miles. To Kyle, Luther wasn't a man. He was background noise. Someone to humiliate when the day felt slow. When the court hall was quiet, you could still hear Kyle's voice cutting through the air. "Mop boy," he'd mutter with a sneer loud enough for everyone around to hear. Still scrubbing floors like your life depends on it. Sometimes he'd block Luther's path just to make him pause. Other times, he'd spill his own coffee just to force Luther to clean it up in front of a crowd. I once watched him drop a file on purpose and say, "You missed a spot, better get that mop boy," as if Luther were his personal servant. And Luther, he never snapped, never bit back. That's what drove Kyle mad. Luther's silence didn't feel like weakness. It felt like defiance. Quiet, deliberate defiance. And men like Kyle couldn't stand being ignored. But here's what made it worse. Nobody stopped him. Not the clerks, not the bailiffs, not the attorneys, not even Judge Madeline Grant. She saw it. I know she did. She'd walk right past as Kyle baited Luther. Her face unreadable, her stride steady, never turning her head. Some said she didn't care. Some said she was focused on bigger things. But I saw something else. There were moments, just flashes, where her eyes lingered a second longer. Not pity. Not anger. Calculation. Like she was watching a storm build, waiting for the moment lightning would strike. Meanwhile, Kyle kept pushing. He was relentless. And he pushed because he believed he could. He believed Luther wouldn't push back. One afternoon, everything boiled to the surface. The courthouse was packed, hearings delayed, people on edge. Luther was mopping near the front lobby when Kyle stormed through the metal detectors like a man late for war. He saw Luther. He saw the mop bucket. And for a second, I swear he smiled. He kicked the bucket. Hard. Water splashed across the marble floor. A sharp crash echoed down the hallway. Papers rustled. Conversations stopped. Kyle stepped close, too close. His voice dropped low, sharp, like a blade. "You deaf old man, I said this floor better be dry before the judge shows up. Or do you need me to show you how to do your job?" Luther didn't move. Not right away. He looked at the water, then at Kyle, and I watched his hand tighten around the mop handle, not raised, just held, steady. I held my breath. Everyone did. And that silence, it was thick, too thick, like the whole building was waiting to see what would happen next. But Luther just nodded, bent down, began to clean, no words, no expression. Kyle scoffed, walked away like he'd won some battle no one else was fighting. But he didn't see what I saw. Luther's eyes weren't lowered in shame. They were focused, calm. The kind of calm that made you wonder just how much a man can carry before he chooses not to carry it anymore. That moment didn't end with yelling. It didn't end with fists. But it was the moment I realized Kyle had crossed a line. Not the kind written into court policy. The kind a decent man knows not to step over. And Luther. He didn't stop him. Not because he couldn't. Because he was waiting. Waiting for the day Kyle would go one step too far. And none of us, not Kyle, not the judge, not me, were ready for what that day would bring. It was the kind of morning that felt heavy before it even began. Overcast sky, humid air pressing through the courthouse windows. The docket was packed 3 cases behind before the first one was even called. People were tense lawyers, snapping at assistants clerks, running back and forth with coffee cups shaking in their hands. The courtroom itself buzzed with the low murmur of voices trying to stay polite while barely keeping frustration in check. Luther was already there as usual, mopping the back aisle, moving slow and deliberate, careful not to interfere with anyone. The hearing underway was over a disputed land title, 2 families, 1 piece of property, and decades of resentment waiting to explode under oath. It was messy, personal, the kind of case where you could feel the emotion rising before the first witness even took the stand. I was seated near the back reviewing a case file when I saw it happen. Luther had just turned toward the bench, rolling his bucket behind him. The handle of his mop nudged a small metal thermos someone had left near the wall. It tipped, then dropped. The sound it made, sharp, sudden, bounced off the wood panels like a gunshot. Not loud enough to startle a crowd, but enough to make every head turn, including Kyle Branson's. He had been leaning against the courtroom door, arms crossed, jaw tight like always. But the moment the thermos hit the floor, Kyle pushed himself off the wall and strode forward with quick, purposeful steps. There was no hesitation, no pause to assess, just movement like a man already convinced of what he was going to do. "What the hell are you doing?" Kyle's voice cut across the room, louder than the judge, louder than the attorneys, louder than it had any right to be. Luther stopped. He turned, met Kyle's voice with silence. I said, "What are you doing?" Kyle's face was flushed now, making a mess during a hearing. "You think this is your kitchen floor?" Luther opened his mouth to speak. I saw him try. But Kyle didn't give him the chance. "You people never learn to stay in your place," Kyle muttered, stepping in close. Too close. Then it happened. His hand came up fast and open. A sharp crack broke through the courtroom air as Kyle's palm landed across Luther's cheek. A real slap. Hard, uncontrolled. The sound of it echoed louder than the thermos ever had. And then silence. Real silence. Not just the absence of voices. The kind of silence that bends the air, that makes your chest feel tight, that tells you something irreversible has just taken place. Luther stood still. His face turned slightly from the blow, but he didn't raise his hands. He didn't move. He just stood there, shoulders straight, jaw tight, eyes somewhere distant. Nobody said a word. The attorneys froze. The plaintiffs froze. Even the court clerk, who normally whispered through every proceeding, sat wide-eyed and pale. Every person in that room watched, waiting for someone else to do something first. Then from behind the bench came the sound of a single gavel strike. Crisp, final. All heads turned toward the bench. Judge Madeline Grant stood. Her robe moved slightly as she leaned forward, voice low but unmistakably clear. "This court is adjourned." She paused. Let the weight of her words settle. Then sharper. "Officer Branson, leave the room." Kyle's mouth opened as if to protest, but before he could form a word, she added, "You just struck my father." It didn't hit me right away. Not fully. Not until I saw Kyle's face twist from arrogance to confusion, and then fear. The room didn't erupt. It didn't need to. The moment was too precise, too sharp to be met with noise. My chest tightened. I looked at Luther again, still unmoving. But now, everything about him had changed. He hadn't spoken, he hadn't lifted a hand, but his silence now roared through every beam of the courthouse. People began to whisper. Chairs scraped the floor. Someone in the jury box dropped a pen and didn't bother to pick it up. And me, I couldn't stop staring at Judge Grant. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't shouting. Her eyes were locked on Kyle like a steel trap. And all I could think over and over again was how none of us had seen it coming. The janitor, the judge, the slap. The truth that had been hiding in plain sight. And now there was no turning back. You could feel it even after the room had emptied. Like the walls were still holding their breath. The moment Judge Madeline Grant spoke those words, "You just struck my father," it was as if something ancient and silent had cracked wide open. No one could quite process what they'd heard. People didn't talk about it at first. They whispered. They guessed. But they didn't say it out loud, not right away. It was too big, too strange. The janitor. That janitor, her father. The news didn't walk, it flew. Down the courthouse corridors, through side offices, into chambers and break rooms. Phones buzzed. Eyes widened. Conversations broke mid-sentence. Some laughed like it was a joke. Some stopped mid-step, shook their heads, and went quiet. But Luther didn't stop for any of it. He walked out of that courtroom without a word. Not to the clerk, not to the attorneys, not even to Madeline. The slap mark was still there, a red imprint blooming across his left cheek. He didn't touch it. He didn't cover it. He walked with the same quiet posture he always had. But something about it was different now. It was no longer the quiet of a man trying not to be seen. It was the quiet of a man who no longer needed to hide. I followed him. I didn't plan to. I didn't even know why I did. Maybe because no one else had moved. Maybe because something in me knew that what we'd just witnessed, what he had just endured, deserved more than silence. He was unlocking his car, same old sedan he parked in the back lot every day. No dents, no stickers, just plain and dependable. He paused when he heard my footsteps. "Mr. Miles," I said, unsure how to begin. "Why didn't you, after what happened in there, why didn't you say something?" He turned slowly, his face still unreadable but calm. Always calm. Then he said in that steady voice of his, "A man doesn't have to raise his voice to raise his child." And then he got in, started the car, and pulled away. No drama, no grand gesture, just gone. But I stood there a while. The parking lot was half empty. The courthouse behind me felt colder than usual, and I realized I wasn't shaken by the slap or even the reveal. I was shaken by how easily we'd all ignored him for so long. Because, truth be told, Luther hadn't changed in that moment. We had. That night, long after the building had gone quiet and the sun had dipped below the trees, a silver car pulled into a modest complex on the far side of town. One porch light was left on. Nothing fancy. Just a dim yellow glow over a third-story door. Madeline stepped out of the car, out of her roll, out of her robes. She walked up the stairs in silence, knocked twice, and waited. Luther opened the door without asking who it was. Their eyes met. No surprise, no hesitation. Just a shared stillness that said more than words ever could. He let her in. They sat in his kitchen across from one another at a small table pushed against the wall. There was no wine, no soft music, no performance. Just two people who had waited a long time to sit face to face as father and daughter. She told him she was sorry. Not for what she'd said in court, but for waiting so long to say it. She said she couldn't keep it buried anymore. That the moment Kyle raised his hand, something inside her snapped. That silence wasn't safety. Not anymore. Luther listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't deflect. And when she finished, he said quietly, "I've walked through worse for less. This, I walked through for you." She reached across the table and took his hand. No tears. No dramatic confession. Just the quiet restoration of something that had been lost but never gone. It wasn't the first time Luther had taken pain without protest. It wouldn't be the last. But for the first time in a long while, he wasn't carrying it alone. And for the first time, Madeline wasn't hiding from where she came from. What none of us could have known then was that this moment, this quiet evening, this simple act of truth exchanged between two people, was only the beginning. Because what happened next wouldn't just change the way people looked at Luther Miles. It would change the way they looked at justice itself. There are some stories people bury so deep they start to believe they were never real. But silence doesn't erase memory. It only hides it behind closed doors under quiet mornings and between the lines of unfinished conversations. The day after the courtroom incident, people at the courthouse still couldn't look at Luther the same way. They passed him like always, but now with stolen glances, forced smiles, eyes filled with confusion, and the kind of curiosity that comes too late. They wondered how they missed it, how someone could be there every day yet carry a secret so large and say nothing at all. But Luther had been carrying more than they could imagine, long before the janitor uniform, before the mop bucket and worn hallway keys. Luther Miles was a staff sergeant in the United States Army. Logistics, disciplined, dependable. He served with quiet distinction, built a reputation as the kind of man you could count on when everything else fell apart. He never made headlines, never sought them. That wasn't who he was. When he left the service, he found his footing in Crestwood, working part-time at the courthouse to stay busy. That's where he met her Caroline Grant. She wasn't a judge back then. She wasn't even married. She was a young assistant district attorney with too many case files and not enough hours in the day. Caroline was smart, sharp-tongued, and fearless in court, but off the bench she was kind, curious. And when she crossed paths with Luther in the early mornings before trial, something unexpected began to form. They started with small talk, coffee in the break room, a shared complaint about the building's broken heating. Over time, it became more. Luther respected her fire. She admired his stillness. It wasn't public. It couldn't be. In Crestwood, a black man and a white woman building a life together was still something whispered about, especially in a place where reputations were currency, where last names opened doors or closed them. Caroline knew that. So did Luther. But they didn't stop. They kept it quiet, held hands in empty parking lots, wrote notes instead of texts, built a world inside silence. And when Caroline became pregnant, they both believed it was a beginning, until her family stepped in. The Grants were old Crestwood, wealthy, white, politically connected. Her father had once been a state judge. Her brother was eyeing a seat in Congress. A child born of Caroline and Luther was more than scandal. It was ammunition for enemies. They gave her an ultimatum: quiet the relationship, stay in the family, raise the child as one of us, or be cut off completely. Luther didn't fight. He didn't argue. He told Caroline to do what she needed to do to protect their child, that he'd step away if it meant the baby could have a better life. And he did. He disappeared from her public life, took a job in another district, left no trace of the man he'd hoped to become. Caroline raised Madeline alone with her maiden name in a house full of expectations and tight smiles. She told Madeline her father had left early, that he wasn't part of their story. She didn't lie out of cruelty. She lied because that's what people like the Grants had taught her to do, and for years Madeline believed it. But the truth has its own way of finding cracks. Caroline was diagnosed with cancer in her 50s. It came fast, took faster, and just before she passed, she gave Madeline a sealed envelope. No instructions. Just her name on the outside written in her mother's delicate script. Inside was a letter. 2 pages. The ink had faded in places, but the message was clear. If you ever find him, know that silence was his way of loving you. It broke something open in Madeline. Not anger, not grief, just hunger. A hunger to understand the part of herself that had been erased before she was born. She searched for Luther quietly, carefully. It didn't take long. Turns out it's hard to hide when you're not trying. He had returned to Crestwood years earlier after she left for college, working quietly at the courthouse where their story began. She walked past him 100 times and never knew. The day she approached him, it wasn't some dramatic reunion. She didn't cry. He didn't reach for her. They sat on a bench outside the building, watched the parking lot traffic, and spoke like 2 people who had already missed too much to pretend they could catch up. But something passed between them: recognition. Not just of blood, but of choices. He told her he'd stayed close to protect her from a distance. She told him she wasn't a child anymore. And from that moment on, they carried a secret. Together. Madeline kept it from the courthouse, from colleagues, from press, from friends. Not out of shame, but out of fear. Fear of what the revelation would cost him. Fear of what it might cost her. She knew Luther's silence wasn't weakness. It was armor. A way of surviving in a place that never truly welcomed him. So she didn't take it away from him. She honored it. Until the day that slap made silence no longer an option. Because that slap wasn't just skin on skin. It was humiliation. It was history repeating itself in the most public, brutal way. And when Madeline stood up in that courtroom, it wasn't planned. It wasn't political. It was personal. It was a daughter refusing to let her father be erased again. Now the story that had once been hidden in shadows was out in the open. And the people of Crestwood, who had never bothered to look twice at the man behind the mop, were about to learn who he really was. Not just a janitor, a father, a soldier, and the living reminder that truth, no matter how long buried, always rises. Truth has a way of making people uncomfortable, especially when it shows up uninvited in broad daylight and refuses to be swept under the rug. By the next morning, the courthouse was no longer just a courthouse. It was a pressure chamber. Everyone was talking. But now they whispered with urgency, with fear, with a tone that said this was no longer office gossip. It was something bigger, something that could break the surface of their carefully managed reputations. The state judicial board moved fast, too fast. Within hours, a private conference was scheduled behind closed doors, high up in the administrative building, far from the noise of the courtroom and the people it supposedly served. Inside that room sat men and women in suits too expensive for transparency. They didn't speak like judges or protectors of justice. They spoke like public relations managers. One of them, a senior commissioner with a voice that dripped condescension, broke the tension first. He tapped a pen on the table and said, "If this turns into a media circus, if people start saying a black janitor was assaulted in court by a white officer and the judge is his daughter, we're not just looking at headlines. We're looking at trust dissolving across this entire state." Another chimed in, less polished, more direct. "If she cries on camera," he said, "if this becomes about race and legacy and how we failed, the court's credibility will crack wide open." They didn't talk about Kyle's behavior. They didn't talk about the slap. They didn't talk about what it meant for a man like Luther to be humiliated in the very place where justice is supposed to live. They talked about optics. The story was too volatile, too loaded. A white officer, a black father, a daughter who wore the robe and carried the state's seal. If the public rallied behind her, they'd have to answer for why this man had been invisible for so long, why Kyle Branson had a record of complaints that never went anywhere, why silence had been policy. So they chose the safer enemy. Madeline Grant. She was called in under the guise of review, told it was a routine ethics consultation following a courtroom disruption. But the moment she stepped into that cold, glass-paneled boardroom, she knew what it really was. They were looking for control, and she was in the way. The questions came sharp, rehearsed, polished with fake concern. "Did you know the janitor personally before that day? Were you aware of Officer Branson's history with courthouse staff? Do you feel your emotions clouded your professional judgment?" She answered calmly, without apology. She gave them the truth, the whole truth, and nothing they wanted to hear. Then came the real request. A pause, a breath, a chair shifting ever so slightly. "We believe," said one commissioner leaning forward, "that given the potential conflict of interest, it may be best if you recuse yourself from all proceedings related to this matter, just until it settles down." Another followed up. "And for the sake of the court's image, we'd advise you not to make any further public statements. No interviews, no written commentary. Let the system take care of itself." She didn't flinch, but you could feel something shift in the air. The moment where silence was no longer a choice, but a demand. And when someone demands silence from a woman who's held it for most of her life, who's watched her own father absorb humiliation to protect her, there's only so much grace left to offer. She leaned forward, voice steady low. "If protecting my father costs me this robe, then so be it." The room went still. No one expected that. They expected her to blink, to compromise, to protect her career the way they protected their power. But she didn't. She stood, straightened her coat, and walked out without looking back. Across town, Kyle Branson sat in a government office, feet up on a desk that didn't belong to him, telling Internal Affairs exactly what he thought of the situation. "He was just a janitor," Kyle said. Eyes rolled to the ceiling. "How the hell was I supposed to know he mattered?" He laughed after he said it, out loud, because to him that still made sense. In his world, people mattered only when they wore a badge or sat behind a bench, and Luther in his eyes had neither. But what Kyle didn't understand, and never would, is that some men don't need power to be powerful. That there are fathers who live quietly so their daughters can rise. That dignity doesn't wear a name tag or carry a gun. It just walks through fire every day without asking for applause. And now, for the first time, the system didn't just have to reckon with the truth. It had to reckon with the man who carried it, because Luther Miles wasn't invisible anymore, and Madeline Grant wasn't afraid to be seen beside him. The hearing room wasn't as grand as the main courtroom, but that day it held a silence just as heavy. It was a procedural setting, stiff-backed chairs, laminated name tags, a row of panelists behind a long desk, pretending not to be nervous. Reporters weren't allowed, but word had already reached every hallway in Crestwood. They all knew what this was about, even if the official memo didn't say his name. It was a closed-door disciplinary hearing for Officer Kyle Branson. But really, it was a test. A test of whether the system could look itself in the mirror and recognize what it had allowed to happen. Kyle was there, of course, sitting with the same smug defiance he always wore when he thought he was untouchable. A union rep at his side, one hand draped lazily over the table as if he already knew how this would end. Most people in that room expected it to be routine, quiet, clinical. They had no idea what was coming. Then Luther Miles stood up. He wasn't on the list to speak. He hadn't requested time. But when he rose from the back row, straightened his jacket, and walked slowly to the front, no one stopped him. It was the way he moved. The weight behind each step. Not heavy, but certain. Like a man who'd spent a lifetime being told to stay seated, and now finally was ready to stand. He didn't look at Kyle. He didn't look at the press secretary taking notes in the corner or the judge tapping her pen, waiting to object. He looked straight at the panel, and then he spoke. His voice was gravel worn down by years of silence, but steady. My name is Luther Miles. I've worked in this building for 27 years. Before that, I served in the United States Army. Staff Sergeant, Logistics Command, 2 tours. No medals on my chest, but I carried men out of places most people wouldn't walk into. And when I came home, I chose this courthouse because I still believed in something. There was no outrage in his tone, no bitterness, just a quiet resolve that made people lean forward without realizing it. I've mopped these floors in the mornings before the sun came up, cleaned blood off benches after trials that didn't end well, picked up pieces no one else wanted to see. And I did it not because I had to, but because I believed that justice, real justice, was worth standing near, even if I didn't get to speak it. His eyes didn't blink, his hands didn't shake. Until last week, I was just a janitor to most of you. A background figure. Someone whose name you didn't need to learn. But I am also a father. And whether you like the sound of that or not, my daughter wears the robe in this room because I raised her to believe in fairness, even when the world tried to make her forget what that meant. The room had gone still. Even Kyle had stopped shifting in his chair. Then Luther reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Yellowed, creased, carefully opened. He didn't announce what it was. He didn't need to. He began to read. If you ever find him, his voice trembled slightly, know that silence was his way of loving you. He paused, looked up. That was from her mother. A woman who loved me in a time when loving me came with a cost. We were told to separate, to stay quiet, to keep our child safe by keeping the truth buried. So I did. He folded the paper again, gently. But silence shouldn't be the price of dignity. Not then, not now. One of the board members lowered her eyes. Another cleared his throat as if trying to break the spell in the room. Luther didn't let them. I'm not here to ask for punishment. I'm not here to get revenge. What I want is something this place should have offered me long ago. He leaned forward, both hands resting on the table. I want to be seen. Then he turned, walking slowly back to his seat, not looking left or right. And as he sat down, the room remained frozen. Not a word. Not a chair squeaked. Just the sound of people trying to process the weight of something they could no longer ignore. After a long pause, one of the younger clerks in the back wiped her eyes. A bailiff stared down at his lap, fists clenched but silent. Even Kyle's smug, careless Kyle looked smaller in that moment. And just before the next name was called, just before the hearing resumed, Luther spoke once more, voice quiet but clear enough to carry. Justice doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts with how we see people. And that was the moment, more than the slap, more than the reveal, when the room truly shifted. Because now they had heard him, and they couldn't unhear him. Some men fall because of what they do. Others fall because of who they are when the spotlight turns off. After the hearing, the air shifted around Kyle Branson. He wasn't fired, not yet, but he was suspended pending a final review. No badge, no authority, no courtroom to control. And for the first time in years, Kyle walked into buildings without the weight of a uniform behind him. People no longer looked at him with respect. They looked past him. Or worse, straight through him. For a man like Kyle, that was unbearable. But he wasn't foolish. He knew how public opinion worked. He saw how quickly the narrative was slipping. Online threads, community forums. Even the local paper started using phrases like systemic disrespect and racial misconduct. And whether he believed any of it or not, Kyle understood one thing with perfect clarity. He was losing the story. So he decided to reclaim it the only way he knew how. It started with a knock on Luther Miles's apartment door 3 days after the hearing. It was early evening, soft light slipping through the blinds. Luther had just finished folding his laundry when he heard it. When he opened the door, Kyle was standing there, not in uniform, not with a badge, but with a man holding a phone behind him recording. Kyle didn't ask to come in. He didn't even greet Luther properly. He just started speaking loud enough to carry, measured enough to sound rehearsed. Mr. Miles, he began, eyes flicking briefly to the camera. I've taken some time to reflect on what happened, and I realize now that my actions were hurtful and wrong. I let my position cloud my judgment, and for that I want to offer my sincere apology. He paused as if expecting Luther to respond, but Luther didn't speak. He stood still in the doorway, watching. Kyle shifted slightly, angling his body so the lighting hit his face better. This experience, he continued, has taught me a great deal about humility and about seeing people for who they truly are. Another pause. The man with the phone stepped in a little closer, and that's when it became clear. Kyle wasn't there to apologize. Not truly. He was there to capture the performance of an apology, to record a narrative, to control damage. His eyes, though practiced, didn't linger on Luther. They returned again and again to the lens. His tone softened where it needed to, his words chosen to check every box a publicist would approve. But he wasn't looking for forgiveness. He was looking for footage. Luther let him finish. He didn't interrupt. He didn't stop the camera. He didn't close the door. He simply waited. And when Kyle reached the end of his well-crafted script, when the silence grew just uncomfortable enough to demand a reaction, Luther finally spoke. Quiet, steady. "You're not sorry," he said. "You're scared. There's a difference." The words didn't sting, they didn't shout, but they landed like a weight in the center of the doorway. Kyle opened his mouth, maybe to respond, maybe to defend, but nothing came out, because there was nothing left to say. No one had called him out like that before. Not in a way he couldn't dismiss, not in a tone that didn't give him room to retaliate. He stood there, eyes caught between the man in front of him and the camera behind him. Then, without another word, he turned, gave a stiff nod to the man recording, and walked down the steps. The camera stayed on Luther for a second longer, as if waiting for a final reaction. But there wasn't one. Just the sound of the door closing soft, firm final. Inside, Luther sat back down, picked up the folded towel he'd left behind, and resumed what he was doing before the knock. He didn't tell anyone what had happened that night. He didn't need to. Because sometimes winning doesn't come with applause. It comes in knowing you didn't let someone else rewrite your truth. And that evening, without raising his voice, without lifting a hand, Luther Miles reminded the world that dignity doesn't chase cameras. It simply stands, then walks away. Justice. When it finally arrives, rarely looks like the headlines we expect. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it settles like dust after a storm, quiet but irreversible. Weeks had passed since the hearing. The case file that once sat heavy on Madeline's desk was now closed, not with a bang, but with a decision that would ripple far beyond that courthouse. The state's disciplinary board met one final time, not behind locked doors, but in full view of legal observers and state representatives. Their ruling was clear, unambiguous. Kyle Branson was officially removed from the state's judicial enforcement registry. His name would not appear on any law enforcement roster again. No transfers, no reinstatement, no quiet reassignment to another district. The verdict wasn't labeled as punishment, but as irreparable breach of public trust. For a man who had once strutted through courtrooms with unchecked authority, it was the only kind of silence he'd never prepared for. As for Madeline Grant, the cloud of investigation that had loomed over her for weeks was finally lifted. The Ethics Review Board unanimously cleared her of any wrongdoing. The community had already made its decision long before the papers did. Across town, handwritten signs were taped to shop windows. "We stand with Madeline." Retired judges sent letters of support. And for the first time in her career, her title felt lighter, less like armor, more like purpose. She gave no victory speech, no long address. When the press gathered in the courthouse foyer, she stepped up to the microphones, took a breath, and simply said, "Some heroes carry guns, others carry mops," and then she walked away. But perhaps the moment that stayed with people most wasn't in a headline or a ruling or even a quote. It was what happened the day Luther Miles came in to turn in his badge. It was a small piece of metal shaped more like a time card than an emblem, but to him, it had meant something. It had meant service dignity, showing up before dawn and staying after dark, moving through halls where he was invisible until he wasn't. He didn't leave in protest. He didn't retire out of defeat. He simply said, "It's time." "I didn't stay to be seen," he told Jaden quietly that morning. "I stayed so I could watch something better grow here." He had packed up his locker the night before. No fuss, no announcement. Just folded his uniform with care, tucked the letter of resignation neatly into an envelope, and placed it on the desk in the janitorial office with his nameplate turned down. But when he entered the building for the last time, something had changed. From the clerk at the front desk to the stenographers in the hall, people stood as he passed. Not dramatically, not forced, but with sincerity. They didn't cheer, they didn't chant, they simply rose to their feet. And as he reached the courtroom doors one last time, Madeline stood waiting. She said nothing, just opened the door for him. A small gesture. But in that building and that history, it meant everything. Inside the courtroom was nearly full. Not for a case, not for a verdict, but for him. Luther Miles didn't give a farewell speech. He didn't recount his service. He didn't list the injustices he'd seen. He just looked around, nodded once, and said, "You know who you are now. That's enough for me." Then as he turned and walked down the aisle, every person in that room, judges, clerks, attorneys, even former critics, rose. Not because he demanded it, because he deserved it. That was the first time he'd ever been honored in that space, and it would be the last. The sun was just beginning to soften over Crestwood when the courthouse doors opened that evening. Not the grand double doors of ceremony, but the side exit, the one rarely used by judges or staff. And yet, on this day, that quiet path became a stage for a moment no one would forget. Luther Miles stepped out first, his pace calm, steady as ever. But this time he wasn't alone. Beside him walked Madeline Grant, her black robe draped over her arm, her posture not rigid like a judge, but relaxed like a daughter walking beside the man who shaped her soul long before the world gave her a title. And then, in a gesture that said more than any press release ever could, she reached for his hand. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. This was not a performance. It was a reunion finally allowed to happen in daylight. People paused, some across the street, some at the steps. A few recognized them. Whispered, gasped softly, unsure if they were witnessing something personal or historic. The truth was, it was both. Among the onlookers stood Jaden, pressed back near the railing, unsure whether to step forward or simply let the moment breathe. He hadn't planned to be there. He told himself he was just passing by, but the truth was he couldn't stay away. And as he watched the two walk side by side, their strides neither fast nor slow, he felt something stir in his chest. Luther had rarely spoken during all those months they shared shifts. He never lectured, never explained himself. But now, watching the silence between them say everything, words couldn't. Jaden heard the clearest thing the old man had ever taught him. He didn't speak often, but when he did, it stayed. Luther paused just before reaching the end of the stone path. There, nestled between the columns and the hedges, was a polished bronze plaque bearing the names of honored service members, employees who had dedicated their lives to the pursuit of justice in that building. Near the top was a name just recently added, Honorable Madeline Grant, first black female chief judge of Crestwood Circuit. Luther looked at it not with pride swelling in his chest, but with peace. His smile wasn't wide. It was quiet, lived in. The kind of smile that carried the weight of years without needing to boast about them. Jaden, unable to stop himself, approached. He took slow steps, respectful of the space between them. When Luther turned slightly, Jaden offered the question that had been burning in his chest since the day he first saw that slap, since the moment everything changed. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "All those years." Staying silent, Luther didn't answer right away. He looked at the plaque once more, then turned fully toward Jaden, his voice low but clear. "No," he said, "she's my voice now." And somehow that was enough. Because in that one sentence, everything made sense. The decades of quiet, the choice not to retaliate, the decision to be present in the shadows rather than absent in protest. It all led here, to this woman beside him, to this moment, to this legacy. They resumed walking. No crowd followed. No camera rolled. Just the sound of footsteps on old pavement and the faint rustle of wind carrying the story out into the world. And though no one said another word, those watching didn't hear silence. They heard something else entirely, a quiet that held meaning, a quiet that left an echo, a quiet that sounded somehow like justice. Thank you for staying with us through this powerful story. What you just heard wasn't just about a janitor, a courtroom, or even a slap. It was about dignity in silence, strength passed through generations, and the quiet kind of justice that doesn't seek attention, it earns it. At Mr. Mac Stories, we believe the most unforgettable voices often come from the people no one notices. If this story moved you, if it made you pause and reflect, please give it a like, Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe to our channel for more true-to-heart stories like this one. Your support means the world to us. It's what fuels our team to keep bringing you meaningful content that stays with you long after the video ends. Because here at Mr. Max Stories, we don't just tell stories, we remember them.